I recently had a delightful interaction on Blue Sky the other day. When I posted some of my cozy fantasy bookish macarons, someone replied very sincerely and kindly that they weren't familiar with cozy fantasy and if I had any recommendations for them. And oh my goodness, you should have seen how I reacted!
You're asking me about my theories? I've waited years for someone to ask me about my theories! Hang on, I made a model!
Now you might think that I'm joking, but I'm very serious. In fact, I even put on full fantasy hobbit garb and I made a model! Well, it's more of a flowchart, but same difference really. Let's begin. Yes, I bought a pointer stick just for this video. They should not have allowed me to buy this. I'm gonna be a menace. An absolute menace. Okay, before diving into my actual recommendations, let's just make sure we're all on the same page about what I mean when I say cozy fantasy. The actual definition of cozy fantasy is still kind of loosey-goosey. Basically, what we mean by cozy fantasy when we're talking about the cozy fantasy subgenre is a book within the fantasy genre that has cozy elements and lower stakes. Generally, you're not feeling too stressed out reading a cozy fantasy book. I like to liken it to the opposite feeling you have when you're watching Game of Thrones. Like, generally, you're not concerned that the main characters are ever going to be in real mortal peril.
Then you've got no arms left. Yes, I have. Look! It's just a flesh wound.
There's also quite a few elements to cozy fantasies that are pretty popular in the subgenre. Found family is a big one. Cute, cozy pets and critters is another one. Sometimes they're often smaller slice of life moments instead of these larger, grand, epic fantasies and adventures is what the story focuses on. So that's generally what I mean when I say cozy fantasy. And also, I would point out that cozy means different things to different people. Different aspects of books might be cozy to you and might be cozy to somebody else. The other disclaimer I will give about my cozy fantasy recommendations before I dive in is this is by no means an extensive list of cozy fantasy recommendations. This is really just scratching the surface on where to begin. And with that, let's begin. Alrighty, cozy fantasy, where to begin, or cozy fantasy for the noobs.
It's just a baby!
The first thing I want to ask is, what do you feel about cozy fantasy? Are you intrigued? Are you unsure? Or are you maybe a little skeptical?
I'm not sure I'm interested in that.
Depending on how you initially feel about cozy fantasy is going to play a big role in where I think you should begin. So let's go ahead and assume you generally have positive feelings when you hear cozy fantasy. You're kind of intrigued. You've already started to buy into the hype.
Yeah!
Then I think the best place to start is with the OG Legends and Lattes. Now, Legends and Lattes is not the first book that's ever been published that could fit under the cozy fantasy subgenre, if you will, but it is the book that I think really popularized this as a subgenre. And for good reason. It's a very good book, and it's also the first cozy fantasy book I read. So it's an excellent place to start. What I like about Legends and Lattes is it feels very nostalgic if you are familiar with Dungeons and Dragons or have read Lord of the Rings, and you want to step into a world that has kind of similar characters and magic systems. Legends and Lattes very much feels like a D&D one-shot, and it is extremely cozy. If you don't know already, it is about an orc who leaves behind her adventuring party to live kind of a more slower, peaceful life and decides to set up a coffee shop. Now, of course, it would be a very boring book if everything went according to plan. So, of course, there are some shenanigans that happen as she's trying to set up this coffee shop. But luckily, she finds kind of a found family of fellow misfits in the town she's decided to settle in to help her through some of these shenanigans. A very good book, and I highly recommend the audio for this one if you like audiobooks. The author, Travis Baldree, fun fact, actually was an audiobook narrator before he was a writer, and he does the audiobook narration for this and does all the characters. It is adorable. Very much recommend. Next up, let's say you've read Legends and Lattes and you're very bought into the hype. The next book I would recommend is Bookshops and Bonedust. This is also by Travis Baldree. It's in the same universe, but it is a prequel, and I actually kind of liked it better than Legends and Lattes. But I'm also a sucker for books about books, and this mostly takes place in an adorable bookshop. Now, if you've read Legends and Lattes and you liked it, but you wished there were more dragons, then I recommend you check out Can't Spell Treason Without T by Rebecca Thorne. This book has a lot of similar themes to Legends and Lattes. It is also centered around a woman who is trying to leave behind a more kind of adventurous, stressful life and start up a tea shop with her girlfriend. Sorry, a tea and bookshop with her girlfriend called Tomes and Tea. I mean, how cute is that? But again, there are shenanigans that happen in the town they decide to kind of escape to, and yes, there are dragons. Highly, highly recommend. Very fun book, has slightly more adventure than Legends and Lattes, so if that's kind of what you're more angling towards, you might like this. Now, if you've read Legends and Lattes and you liked it, but you wish there was more romance, maybe even a little bit more spice, okay, I'm not judging, no judgment here, then I recommend you check out the Mead Mishaps series by Kimberly Lemming. These books are very much romantasy. However, they don't take themselves too seriously. They're very funny. Like, I really like Kimberly Lemming's humor in them. The best way to describe the vibes of Kimberly Lemming's books is imagine you're at a Renaissance fair and you're drinking a pint of mead, getting a little bit tipsy, and just start busting out a move and dancing to a bardcore cover of Shakira's These Hips Don't Lie. That is the vibe and the feeling of these books, and I will not be elaborating further. Yeah, that sums it up. Now, let's say you've read Legends and Lattes and you're still kind of unsure.
I gotta admit, I was a little unsure about this.
Or maybe, again, you're brand new to cozy fantasy and you feel very neutral about it. You're not necessarily intrigued, but you're not necessarily skeptical. Then the next book that I highly recommend for beginners of this genre is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. This might be a great place to start, honestly, especially if you don't have that same sort of nostalgia I talked about Dungeons and Dragons. In some ways, this book might be an easier book to kind of dip your toe into the cozy fantasy genre. It takes place in the modern world, except there are witches. And some of those witches make YouTube videos. I'm not joking about that. The main character, Mika Moon, does in fact make YouTube videos at the start of the book. She does these like little magical videos where she's pretending to do magic, but actually she's doing real magic. And somebody on the interwebs happens to see those videos, and they are quasi-responsible for bringing up 3 young orphan witches. And they reach out to Mika and say, hey, we got these 3 orphan witches. Will you come please help us tutor them? I know you're doing real magic. I think this might be a good introduction to cozy fantasy because it is in the modern world. You don't have to learn a complex magic system or anything like that. It's a cozy witch story. And I think this might have a lot of appeal to folks who don't read a ton of fantasy for that reason. This book also has some of the best found family. Every character in this book is adorable. I love them so, so much. Highly recommend. And this book has a little bit of romance in it too that I quite enjoyed. Now let's say you read The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, you really liked it, you want more, then I recommend you read more cozy witchy stories like In the Company of Witches. What's really fun is this one doubles as a cozy mystery too. Now, on the other side of things, like let's take a step back here. Let's say you haven't read any cozy fantasy and you're kind of skeptical about it. Or maybe you've even read Legends and Lattes or The Very Secret Society and you're like,
I'm not sure I'm interested in that.
Needs more action. Then I would read either The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi if you want a more adult, high seas pirate adventure book, or Howl's Moving Castle if you prefer something maybe a bit younger but has kind of those dreamy Ghibli nostalgia vibes. Let's start with The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi. Full disclosure, this is probably the most controversial book I've included on this list because most people wouldn't define this book as cozy fantasy. But I stand by including on this list, okay? And I'll explain. The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi doesn't seem like it's cozy fantasy at first glance. However, it has a lot of cozy elements and a lot of elements found in some of these other cozy books that I think it's a good gateway book into cozy fantasy if you're skeptical and just kind of want to like dip your toes in the coziness waters, if you will. What I think is really fun about The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi and why I personally think it's cozy is because of the framing device and narration style used to tell this story. In fact, I'd say it's very similar in terms of coziness to the movie The Princess Bride. In The Princess Bride, you have a grandfather reading a bedtime story to his sick grandson. You can probably guess that at the end of the day, Princess Buttercup and Wellesley are gonna be all right, or this wouldn't be a very comforting story to read to his grandson. And just like The Princess Bride, The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi might have sword fights, it might have monsters of unusually large sizes, but at the end of the day, because of the framing device, because of the narration, you know Amina and her crewmates are probably going to be okay. And that inherently, I think, kind of lowers the stakes a bit. Also, just to clarify, in Amina al-Sarafi, it's not a grandfather narrating a story to a grandchild, but Amina herself does interrupt the narrator a few times to be like, no, this is how it actually happened, which is very funny, silly, and very cozy. So jumping to Howl's Moving Castle. This is another great place to start if you're kind of skeptical about cozy fantasy, especially if you grew up watching Ghibli movies and already have kind of a sense of the vibes of Howl's Moving Castle. Now, full disclosure, the Ghibli movie Howl's Moving Castle and the book Howl's Moving Castle are very different. I'd say they're very similar about halfway through the book, and then they diverge pretty wildly. For example, Howl never turns into a bird in the book like he does in the movie. However, I actually prefer the book over the movie because we get more of Sophie's backstory and we get to learn more about her as a character. It has a bit more adventure than some of the other cozy fantasies, but at the end of the day, it still feels very comforting, lower stakes in the sense that you're not really worried about Sophie or Howl at the end of the day. You know things are probably going to turn out all right for them and they're gonna have a happy ending. So a great place to start if you're somewhat skeptical. Let's say you've read one of these books and you've bought into the cozy fantasy hype and you'd like to read something next that fits very nice and snugly in the cozy fantasy subgenre. Then I would recommend checking out The Teller of Small Fortunes if you liked the found family aspect of Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi and the fact that there wasn't a romantic subplot. This is a great one to pick up. Teller of Small Fortunes is not about pirates, just FYI. It is about a fortune teller who, as you can guess from the title, tells small fortunes. What you find out while reading the book is she's kind of on the run from this mage guild that she really doesn't want to join. And while she's kind of doing her tour of the countryside and telling small fortunes, she kind of stumbles into a friend group sort of accidentally. And at first she's like, I don't know if I really want all of you tagging along with me, but sure, I guess this is what's happening now. And they go through kind of a series of quests. It feels very much like a series of adventures within a mini D&D campaign. So very fun, cozy vibes. And it has a cute cat in it. In fact, The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi also has a cat in it. A lot of cozy fantasy books have cute pets in them. That's another bonus for reading cozy fantasy. You get to read about really cozy critters. If you read Howl's Moving Castle and want more of those vibes, then I recommend checking out the romantic fantasy Half a Soul. The love interest, very similar to Howl Pendragon from the book. Both kind of melodramatic, both probably need therapy and lots of hugs. Now, let's say you're skeptical about cozy fantasy, not for the reasons I described when I was recommending The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi or Howl's Moving Castle. Let's pretend that you are skeptical of this genre, not because you think it needs more action, but because you want something with maybe darker or heavier themes. In that case, I recommend you check out two cozy adjacent cozy fantasies, Nettle Bone and House of Frank. Nettle Bone is a great one to pick up if you're sort of in the mood for cozy creepy. And I think the best way to explain what I mean by that is to just read you the first sentence of the book. It has one of my favorite openings of any book ever. Actually, I lied. I'm going to read you the first 2 sentences because, again, this is just one of my favorite openings of a book. The trees were full of crows and the woods were full of madmen. The pit was full of bones and her hands were full of wires. I mean, come on, what an opening! So Nettle Bone is written by one of my all-time favorite authors, T. Kingfisher. She does write a lot of cozy books, but she also writes in horror. This one I'd say leans definitely more cozy than some of her horror novellas. And it has kind of these darker, grim fairy tale vibes. It feels very familiar and nostalgic, even though it's not a retelling of any specific grim fairy tale. It just has a lot of fairy tale elements in it. The other thing I would flag about Nettle Bone is it does touch on some heavy themes like abuse, so just make sure you check content warnings for any of the books I mentioned, but especially for Nettle Bone. Let's say it's not cozy creepy you're in the mood for. Maybe you're in the mood for something that has heavy themes, but is more on the cathartic comfort side. You know, something that is gonna just give you a really good cathartic cry. Then you can skip this entire flowchart and just jump straight to House of Rank. This is a lovely book. I personally think it leans more cozy fantasy than cozy fantasy adjacent, but it does deal with some heavy topics. It is about a witch who is grieving, who is learning to heal after the loss of both her sister and her powers. And it is a beautiful book, will most likely make you cry, but the way Jason from Easy Cat Press describes it, I think is a wonderful description. It's just like a warm hug on your worst day. And that is genuinely how this book makes you feel. And that, Cozy Pals, is my presentation on where to begin reading cozy fantasy if you are new to the subgenre. If you happen to have read some cozy fantasy books and have some good suggestions, please feel free to leave a comment and let me know what cozy fantasy books you've either read or are excited to read. Happy reading, everyone, and look forward to hearing from you soon.